是个没有。What actually happens when I click something? I've been learning some basic programming concepts recently, things like Frontend and Backend, source code database, user authentication, and Node.js. I wrote a lot of these things down in my notebook, but I noticed something. If I only write things down and don't actually use them or explain them, I for I for I forget them surprisingly quickly. So today I'm doing another output practice, and instead of trying to explain everything I've learned, I want to focus on just one thing. What actually happens when I interact with a website or an application? When I first learned about front frontend and backend, I understood them in a very simple way. The frontend is what the user sees and interacts with. The backend is what works behind the screen. Scenes，这是什么单词？这个怎么念
？Scenes.
Scenes. The backend is what works behind the scenes. I also heard some useful analogies. Analogies? Analogies.
Analogies.
Analogies. Analogies. I also heard some useful analogies. I also heard some useful analogies.
Analogies.
Analogies. I also heard some useful analogies. For example, the front end is like a waiter in a restaurant, and the back end is like a chef. What waiter interacts with the customer? What waiter interacts with the customer? The chef prepares the food. The chef prepares the food. The chef prepares the food. Another explanation I heard was the front end is like the face and the back end is like the brain. These explanations were helpful, but I realized that I was still thinking about front end and back end as two separate definitions. I knew what each one was supposed to do, but I didn't really understand how they work together. So I started asking a different question. What happens when I actually do something? For example, I enter my username and password. I click a login button. I type something into a search box. I click something on a web page. What exactly happens behind the scenes? Scenes.
Scenes.
Scenes. And then I had an idea. I thought maybe every time I do something on the front end, it sends a request to the backend, and the backend sends a response back. That seemed reasonable to me. I click something, the screen changed, so maybe there must be a request and a response happening somewhere. But then I realized that there was an important problem with this idea. A user action is not necessarily a backend request. That's actually a very important distinction. For example, if I click inside a text box and the cursor starts blinking, something happened, but that doesn't mean my computer had to send a request to a survey.
A server.
A server. But that doesn't mean my computer had to send a request to a server. The front end can handle that by itself. It pressed a key on my keyboard. The browser can receive that event and display the character on the screen. Again, there doesn't have to be a backend request, so the process is not always user action backend response. It can simply be user action, frontend event, frontend handles it. And I think this was an important change in my understanding. The frontend isn't just a screen. It can actually do things. It can respond to clicks. It can handle user input. It can change what is displayed. It can manage information locally, and it only needs to communicate with the backend when it actually needs something from the backend or another external external service, another external service.
Another external service.
Another external service. Then I started thinking about the real application I use called tablets.
Then I started thinking about a real application I use called Typeless.
Then started thinking about a real application I use called tablets. Then I started thinking about a real application I use called tablets. For example, I press a function key and tablets opens its input interface. Then I start speaking. My voice is captured and eventually it becomes text. And I notice that there seems to be some network activity during this process. So I started wondering what exactly is tablet sending to the backend. It's obviously not sending something like a username and password every time I speak. It could be sending audio data. Maybe it sends some information to a speech recognition service. Maybe it sends some information to a speech recognition service. Maybe the audio is processed somewhere else and the result is sent back to my computer. So the whole process could look something like this. I press a key. Tablet receives the event. It starts recording my voice. My voice becomes audio data. That data may be sent to a remote service. The service processes the audio. It converts the speech into text, and then the text comes back to tablets. Finally, I see the text on my screen, and this helped me understand something else. The backend isn't simply a place that handles usernames, and passwords. That's only one example. The backend is more like a place where the application can process requests and perform certain kinds of work. For example, when I log in, the frontend sends my login information, the backend checks it. It may communicate with a database and then it sends the result back to the frontend. When I search for something, the frontend sends my search query.
My search query.
Query，不对吧？这怎么念呢？My search query. My search query. query, my search query. Query, my search query. The backend may search a database or another service. Then it sends the results back, and with something like tablets, the data might be audio instead of text. The backend or another remote service can process that audio and written text. So the important thing isn't really what kind of data I'm sending. The important thing is that different actions can trigger different kinds of processing. I think this is the first time I'm starting to understand frontend and backend as a dynamic system rather than just two definitions. Before I had these separate words in my notebook: frontend, backend, database, API, authentication, but they were just separate concepts. Now I'm starting to connect them. A user does something, the frontend receives the action. Sometimes the frontend can handle it by itself. Sometimes it needs to send a request. The backend receives the request. It may process some information. It may communicate with a database or another service. Then a result comes back, and the frontend shows the result to the user. That's the flow I'm beginning to understand. And honestly, I still don't understand every detail. My example, I don't know exactly what every network request inside tablets is doing. I can see that there is some network activity, but I can't automatically conclude what every piece of data means. And I think that's okay. I don't need to understand the entire implementation right now. What matters is that I can now ask a better question instead of simply asking, what is a front end? I can ask, what happens when I click this button? Instead of asking, what is a backend? I can ask, where does this data go? Who processes it? And how does the result come back? And I think that's a much more useful way for me to learn programming, because I'm not just memorizing definitions anymore. I'm trying to understand what is actually happening inside the software I use every day. And maybe that's what learning programming really means for me right now. Not knowing everything, but slowly learning how to see what is happening underneath the interface.